You had the last sip.
Oh, I've got some right there. Thank you, sir. Okay, if we can get started again. It's funny, unlike on Sunday mornings when I preach, I actually have a timer. I've told members of my congregation, don't bring a watch when I preach, bring a calendar. That's it. That's either that or know that God has called you into a fast. No, sometimes I wonder as Americans, you hear people that go overseas and they talk about, we had a meeting and it lasted, 12 hours. And see, but if God shows up, 12 hours will happen like that. If God doesn't show up, 12 hours would just be torture. So, okay. So what I want to talk about is why race is still so important. And want to begin, it's funny, anybody that knows me knows that when I was in college, my degree's in history. And I've taken these strength finder things from Gallup, from the Gallup organization, and trying to find out what my greatest strength is. And there's a strength called context. And context is when you use the past in order to make sense of the present. And so my wife could tell you, my friends could tell you that history is important to me. I read history all the time because I do believe that human beings make the same mistakes over and over again. And I think part of the reason is because they're ignorant of the fact that people have already made that mistake or people have already tried that way to do things and it didn't work. And I'm not talking about invention. And I'm not talking about the person who would say, why do we need an automobile? The horse is working just fine, So I'm not talking about that kind of thing, but there are decisions that people make that have brought people into wars and other things. And if people understood history, they would know that that's not a viable option. If you can go to the next slide. So a little bit of history. I shared with you, I'm old enough now, I wish I wasn't, but I'm old enough now to have experienced some of these things personally. Going down to Mississippi in the 50s and the 60s, there were still separate drinking fountains. Next, please. And let me share this. One of the reasons why I'm sharing this is when Pastor referred to the riots and some of the other things that happened, people who believe, shouldn't we be past all of this? Slavery happened X number of years ago and all of that. What they forget is this. There are people still alive who experience these things. And these things didn't just go away because some of them, Peggy and I were talking on the way down here. It wouldn't make sense to me if someone went up to a Jewish person, especially an older Jewish person, and say, listen, the Holocaust happened back in the 40s. Why do we still talk about that? Because it's a defining moment. To a Jewish person, it may not quite be as defining as Moses leading the people out of Egypt, but it is something of that magnitude in their history. And they also know that if it happened once, it could happen again. And so they guard the memory of that to make sure that everyone understands the unbelievable limits of evil that the human heart can get to. And so what people forget about slavery is this: if slavery had happened over a 10-year period, we'd be past it. We'd be past it. But when you consider that as early as like 1630, up until after the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, slavery stopped. And if slavery had stopped at that point and there had been opportunity, maybe we wouldn't be talking about these issues much. But with, after Reconstruction period, during which there was a black governor during Reconstruction. There were black members of Congress during Reconstruction. And by Reconstruction, I mean the period of approximately 1865 to 1877. And all of a sudden, doors started opening. And then we know what happened was, then there was a political deal that was made that led to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Mr. Hayes said to the Southerners, if you back my election, I'll pull all the federal troops out of the South. And when the federal troops pulled out, then organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and others stepped in. And so you had a period of Jim Crow. You had laws that pretty much made sure that whites and blacks were not going to associate on a social level or on any kind of equal level ever. And this is an example. Next slide, please. I have two things to say about this. This is from the Civil Rights Movement. You do realize Martin Luther King was, along with the other leaders, were doing civil rights, whether it was sit-ins and other things, during the 50s into the 60s. And they weren't gaining much traction at all. See, we look back at it and we go, oh yeah, there was steady progress and he was famous and he was well known. You know, it wasn't until Selma that things changed. And one of the reasons why was this: it was technology. It wasn't anything but technology. Television became prominent enough that people could see things. Trust me, the Vietnam War would have been a lot more popular if radio had been around rather than television, because television all of a sudden allowed people to see things that, unless you were standing there, things that you would have never seen before. And for some reason, watching scenes like this on television began to touch people who, and you know, who may have had relatives in the South and may have thought that they understood what was going on, or Northern people who were white, who were even sympathetic to it. When they saw this, when they saw fire hoses washing people down the streets, when they saw police clubbing people almost into unconsciousness, during the Selma, something happened. It touched the conscience of enough people cared, and shortly thereafter, you have the legislation that starts to change things. But to be honest with you, some of the changes, we'd love to believe, okay, so then what you're saying is in the 1960s, there was this monumental change. And I'm telling you as a testimony, having lived through that time, no. There still was a period of time. And so I'm going to talk about some of those things. I'm going to talk about later on about gaps. I'm going to talk about the achievement gap. I'm going to talk about the wealth gap, so that people understand, and I tend to be politically conservative. So if you're sitting there and you're a political conservative, so am I. I do not, but, so letting that cat out of the bag. But when it comes to race, I'm not. One of my close friends, and Peggy can attest to this, is Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House. And he and I have talked about these things. And I've talked to Senator Ron Johnson about it too. And I've told them, The difference between the two political parties when it comes to race is this. Republicans want to talk about poverty. They want to talk about opportunity. They want to talk around the edges of the issue of race. Democrats will talk about race. Now, people will say, but they're pandering, but it doesn't matter, because there needs to be national conversations about race that are nasty, dirty, hard, and complex, where people may, on the first day of the conversation, get so mad they don't want to see the other person, but if they commit to staying with it, to watch real change happen. And those conversations are uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable. I'm glad I'm the age I am, because to be honest with you, when I went to college with guys from Plum City and other places. Two of my roommates, one was from Argyle, Wisconsin, and ignorance runs in two directions. He'd never, known an African American before. And I actually asked him, I said, Argyle, Wisconsin, is that where they make those socks? He must have thought, you are dumber than you look. But we would have conversations deep into the night about race and about other things. So because of those experiences, I got to know people, got to have conversations with. But once people saw that, it began to touch them. I've done presentations where I've said this, and I've said this, I guess, directly. Until whites began to care, nothing changed. And it was true. Nothing changed. Next. I mean, one, that was a reality, and I wish I could tell you it was just a reality in the South. Got a slide coming up that talks about a house that my father wanted to buy in Racine. I'll tell you that story when that comes up. Next, please. 1954, that's Linda Brown, one of the landmark Supreme Court cases, Brown versus the Topeka Board. Now, what always amazes me is this. I would have never thought, neither would you, of Kansas as a southern state, would you? Yet, the landmark case about educational discrimination happened in Topeka, Kansas. And this was in 1954, said that separate but equal was no longer legal. And if you don't know anything about that, the way that the South got away with separate hotels and separate schools and all of that was they said, they're separate, but they're equal. And I didn't put any of the slides in, but I can show you schools from that era. One looks like a palatial mansion with Greek architecture. The other's a log cabin. One has about 19 students in a classroom. I've got a picture that shows so many students that I've asked students when I do school presentations. I said, try to count how many kids are in that room. Gathered around a wood-burning stove in the poor school that's all black, and then, again, pillars and other things in the other school. So 1954, next please. Now, this is the Little Rock Nine. And so efforts to desegregate took a long while. And my wife, Peggy, went down to Little Rock to the museum there. Why don't you come up for a minute? Come up for a minute and just share. I'm the introverted extrovert. She's the legitimate introvert, but she's a school teacher. Take a few minutes and just share what you saw.
I'm an introvert. Anyway, what happened was my elementary school is very mixed. Matter of fact, out of 26 kids in my classroom, 17 are minority. Different though. There's African American, there's mixed, there's Hispanic, there's an Irani, there's a Chinese, there's a Palestinian, and we're just all very, very mixed in the classroom. But I belong to a consortium of schools across the nation that deal with the expeditionary learning, and they hold conferences for us so we can develop expeditions for our children, and that's where they learn through seeking an answer to a problem. So I chose to go to the civil rights one, which obviously I would choose, and it was in Little Rock. Now, when Milt talked about the big school, the little school, well, one of the largest schools, high schools in the country is in Little Rock. Huge, beautiful, but the black counterpart was the same structure, like 1/3 of the other school. It was very obviously not equal. Anyway, these statues are outside the Capitol building, Milt, in Little Rock. So we were studying the Little Rock Nine and their experiences going to integrate the schools in Little Rock, and horrendous things these kids experienced. One day, the community came against them, and they had to escape for their lives through a car in the basement of the school that came out the other side. And they went through a great deal. They were spit on, but and every one of them was chosen to be part of this experiment of integration because they had quality families, families that were tight. They were God-fearing kids. And I tell you, they would not have gotten through without a strong faith in the Lord. There were prayer meetings almost every day because this was a horrendous experience for these kids. And I talked to some of them when I was there, and what they went through. I talked to the now older woman who was the little girl that got lost one day, and she couldn't find the group, and she was down by the corner, and they just surrounded her and spit on her all over, so she was soaked in a dress that she had made just for that occasion. But anyway, those kids had to endure incredible deeds of unkindness from their counterparts at the school. But the school did integrate. I was in it, and things have changed, but things are not perfect. But this was, I mean, we're talking about the 50s and 60s still here.
Yeah, so even when there was legislation that happened, the legislation didn't make the changes happen overnight. It's funny, John Kennedy gets an inordinate amount of credit because my parents almost worshiped John F. Kennedy. And then when you study history, what you find out is the person you should have been patting on the back was a Southerner by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Because anything that happened under President Kennedy, his brother Robert, who was the Attorney General, kept hammering on his brother that they had to send troops, National Guard troops, to the South to protect people. Other than that, and it's funny, Robert tended to be less politically motivated than John. Sorry if you got a picture of John F. Kennedy on your refrigerator like my parents did. I apologize to you, but you know, the nice thing about history is sooner or later, if you're down here during your lifetime, but you decide to be up here, as far as how history sees you, sooner or later you'll be there. And if you're up there and you need to be down, history will bring you up or down a peg. Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, pushed through the most significant civil rights legislation. It's one of the ironies of history, but it's the truth. Next. Okay, so given all of that, how much change has there really been? Now I'm going to talk about gaps for a while. Here you have in 2010, 11, 11, 12, 12, 13, graduation rates by ethnicity. And if you're curious about what the white graduation rate is, it's closer to 90%. So there is a gap between all these groups. But if you look at these groups and you see, people would go, yes, but there's some progress. But if you project out how many more years would it take for them to get to 90%? Next, please. When it comes to college, because a lot of the emphasis now in education is to be career and college ready, I can tell you right now that if a student takes the ACT and if they have less than if they have an 18 to 20, they better be hardworking when they go to college. They can go to college and get a degree, but it's going to be their hard work that makes a difference. If they have under an 18, their reading ability and other stuff is such that they're going to struggle and probably will have difficulty with college. So if you look by ethnicity in Wisconsin, and then you look nationally, African Americans have a composite ACT score of 15.9. Again, I said less than 18, it doesn't matter how hardworking you are, you're just going to struggle. And then you go and you see compared to a composite for white students of 21.5. And the composite, to be honest with you, it's mixing hot water with cold water, because there are students who have a composite of 36, which is the highest, and there are students who have a 13, even among white students, but it tends to skew that there are more students who are college ready. And if you look at Latino students have a higher composite on top of it. So that's some of the academics. Next slide, please. Now, having been a superintendent and sat in meetings with the state superintendent and other people who are involved in decision-making, Tony Evers has said publicly, it's not a poverty gap, it's a racial achievement gap. I happen to be in a meeting where he declared that in front of all the superintendents in the state, and then he asked if there were any questions. I stood up and I commended him for being honest enough, because politically that's a hard thing to say, to being honest enough and having the integrity to identify it for what it is. Because if you look at poverty as a factor, poverty doesn't explain why there's a gap. When I was an administrator in Kenosha Unified, I ran their Title I program, supervised schools, and did other things. So I had access to all the data. And I would sit and I would look at affluent African-American students and poor white students, and I would look at their achievement, and it was fairly equal. And so poverty didn't, so you were talking about kids who were not dirt poor and kids who were, but somehow race or ethnicity played a role that you couldn't explain with poverty. And on this, if the achievement gap was reversed, now it's 64% of African-American students in Wisconsin graduate from high school. 93% of whites do. Significant gap, 29% difference. And my contention, having sat in those meetings, is if it was reversed, we'd be moving heaven and earth to try to figure out what was wrong. And for a while, we did that back in the days of affirmative action. Next slide, please. Where things, it's funny, if you look at any chart of data, what you find is this. There was progress being made in the 70s, it went into the early 80s, and then it stopped. And one of the cases, Alan Bakke was a student, I believe, University of California system, medical school, and he couldn't get in because there was a quota system. And so he sued, he went to the Supreme Court, and when he went to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court said you couldn't have quotas. Now, understand something, that up until that point in time, unless you did something unusual, a large number of blacks wouldn't have gotten into college anyhow, or wouldn't have had opportunity to go. So the government decided what they were going to do, and some universities decided they were going to set aside a certain percentage for kids of color. Now, I've wondered, because University of California tried that, the Supreme Court said they couldn't. University of Michigan, there was a case that was significant where they tried the same thing and it didn't happen. And I've often wondered, if your law school, which is what happened in Michigan, if your law school has 800 students, can admit 800 students, can't you have a program so that you're not taking from one student to give to another, but you're still doing what it takes to provide opportunities for those students? By the way, whenever they followed up on students who got into law school because of affirmative action, they found out that once they got in, they did very well. They graduated from that and became really good lawyers. So opening the door for somebody, you know, there's a difference between guaranteeing the outcome, which I would have problems with. See, guaranteeing the opportunity is one thing. Once you get through the door, it's all on you. If you got the smarts, if you work hard enough and all of that, guess what? Plus, you can feel proud about your accomplishment when you succeed. Guaranteeing not only that you get through the door, but that you don't have to put forth effort in order to succeed, I'm not in favor of. And in the United States, that would never fly anyhow, because our history is we're rugged individualists, and we just believe that everybody pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps, which, even though as a country we believe that, most of us know that's not true. It's not. In the process of writing a second book called The Champions, and the subtitle for that book is, the book is written about those who allow us to pull ourselves up by their bootstraps. You know, all of us have people who God sends into our lives at key moments. Maybe we're young and we don't know up from down, and that person steps in, or they see something in us. They see something that we just don't see. They see potential, they see talent or whatever, and they give us the boost that we need then to go on to succeed. By the way, some of the most famous, wealthiest, most successful people in history, almost all of them have that happen. Whether it was Rockefeller or Carnegie, Carnegie happened to be on a train, and there was someone there who was smart enough that they were talking about what you would invest money in if you had money, and they were talking about steel. And as they say, the rest is history. So the Bakke decision is generally seen as the end of affirmative action. And when affirmative action, in other words, when an intentionality to help undo some of the residual effects of the past, when it stopped, the achievement stops. The gains that were being made slow down, and in some instances begin to reverse. Next, please. This is a picture of Carlisle Avenue in Racine. My dad and my mom worked very hard. My mother catered wealthy people's dinners, and my mother cleaned the homes of doctors and lawyers and accountants and others in Racine. My dad worked in a foundry there in Racine. And over time, you know, I feel sorry for my older brothers, because when mom and dad didn't have any money when they were growing up, you know, they just didn't. They were starting out. By the time my parents got to my brother Stan and I, we actually went to the Wisconsin Dells. Now, the Dells wasn't what it is now, you know. Yeah, no, the Dells had Fort Dells was there, and maybe Tommy Bartlett, you know, was young enough, you know, he was probably a kid doing his water ski thing. But I can remember watching my parents prosper. And they reached a point where my dad wanted to buy a different house. And You know, he was ambitious, but he wasn't unrealistic. This house was only like 4 or 5 blocks from the house that he owned. But it was his dream house because it was on a boulevard and it was a step up from where they were. And back at that point, early 70s probably, back at that point, what happened was, because of legislation, they could not tell you, nope, not selling you the home because you're black or Hispanic. They were smarter than that, but they could steer you. If you went to a realtor and you said, I'd like to see a home over there. Well, you know, I think I've got another home that you might be interested in, and it's over here. Or you could have, my parents paid their bills religiously on time. They were not big debt accumulators, and their income was increasing. And to make a long story short, his dream house was one of the houses there. I can't point it out. There's a lower house that's got like a blue roof. It's right next to that. So just a regular middle-class bungalow. They looked at it, and then they found out they couldn't get the financing for it, even though they could sell their own house. And I watched the impact that that had on them. And you gotta understand this. If you move north for opportunity, if you're moving up the ladder, as it were, albeit not that far, but still you're making progress, it's a real kick in the butt to then be told that you can't buy a house. And again, 5 blocks away. 5 blocks away. So I watched that happen to them. Fast forward to 1986. Peggy and I had been married, moved back to Wisconsin after living in Kansas for a while. God blessed us. Somebody in our church gave us the money for down payment of a home, so we went out looking. And at one point, we were looking at houses all over the city, and realtor took us to a particular house, and as I'm walking through that house and looking around, it hits me. Oh my goodness, this was my dad's dream home. It's the same place. And I think she could tell you, it wasn't anything to brag about, was it? It was so average. Thanks to my parents, they had postured me so that I wanted more than what my father wanted, okay, and was able to get more. And so we decided not to buy it. But it's not lost in me the irony that the very home that my father could not get, I could have gotten 14 years later. And that the progress that was made was enough that it postured me to where I could do certain things that my dad couldn't. Next, please. So the wealth gap. When people talk about, well, it's been years ago, why is race still an issue? It's because the wealth gap is one of the residuals for race. It's one of the leftover impacts of race. Now, what you got to think about is this. One of the most common ways for people to build wealth is through housing. During the Great Migration, there were a lot of black people who moved to Chicago, Milwaukee, large cities. But I'm here to tell you, when they moved into rental property, most of them. And you and I know if you rent, you don't build any equity. And you would like to believe, well, but if they were hardworking, they saved lots of money, yes. But the difference is this. The majority, at least in my experience, of older African Americans growing up, they believed in saving, whereas other people were taught how to invest. If you save, I don't care if it was the 50s, the interest rate is still smaller than, given my in-laws. My in-laws accumulated wealth because they knew how to invest money and get a larger return. Now, I'm going to show you an example of the wealth gap next. Yeah, This is median income adjusted in 2014 dollars. And if you look, the median income for African Americans and Hispanics is approximately $43,300. For whites, it's $71,300. So you see that in median income, there's a gap. And if you look at how much money there is in the gap, that's a house payment, that's a quality of life kind of issue as far as what you can do. Next slide. So, lifted these from a PBS special. I'm going to read through them. Here you have Max and Byron Green. About the same age, they work for the same company, they make the same income. By the way, this was early 2000s. They even live in the same neighborhood now. But if you compare their net assets, Max has twice as much wealth as Byron. Okay, so let's look at the difference next. In 1951, the Greens, the African-American family, bought a two-story duplex in one of the areas of Chester, Pennsylvania, that would rent or sell to African-Americans. The Greens scraped together $1,000 for the down payment and mortgaged the $5,500 remaining balance. The Hollands, married in 1948, a financial gift from their parents and a low-interest government VA loan allowed them to stretch their resources, move to a new suburban development on Long Island. So in 1952, they bought a home in an all-white neighborhood or area, Merrick, for $21,500. Now, as we go on, you would think, oh yeah, of course, they bought a more expensive home. That accounts for the wealth gap, but it doesn't. Move on. Job opportunities for black people still very limited. Mr. Green worked as a lab attendant at a nearby refinery. He'd say black men were the last hired, first fired. Mrs. Green provided domestic help for white families in the middle-class suburbs. Mr. Holland financed his college education through the GI Bill. After graduating, he got a job as a management trainee for a big New York textile firm, where he worked for the next 15 years. The sales, technical, and management staff were entirely white. Next slide, please. When manufacturing crashed, many people left Chester, Pennsylvania, and the area became increasingly segregated. Those who stayed faced higher taxes to maintain public services and schools, and while their income remained the same, the Greens saw their expenses climb and their neighborhood began to deteriorate. For the other family, property values were good and getting better. Max and his brothers enjoyed good schools, parks, libraries, etc. 1965, Mr. Holland started his own business by tapping into his home equity and borrowing money from an uncle. His business did well, and he sent all three of his children to private colleges. Next. Byron received an academic scholarship to an Ivy League school. Great opportunity, right? Because of his family's uncertain financial situation, he has always exercised a conservative approach to his personal finances. Max's personal wealth building began at the age of 13 with bar mitzvah checks from friends and relatives. By the time he was 18, Max could use his savings and money from his parents to travel, explore his interests, go to college worry-free. Next. In 2000, the Greens sold their home for $29,500. Remember, they started out with a home where they $6,500, $1,000 down, $5,500 that they had to finance. A negligible increase in value considering the remodeling and improvement they put in over 40 years. This amount has not gone far to provide for Byron's family in old age. At the time of the sale, Chester's population was 76% black. In 1991, the Hollands sold their home for $299,000. I think their home was $21,500 to start with. 14 times what they had paid for it, and were able to retire comfortably to the Berkshire Mountains. They also helped all their children with down payments on their own homes. At the time of the sale, Merrick was still 95% white. Next. In 1994, Byron financed the purchase of a condominium and continues to make monthly mortgage payments today. He also needs to look after his parents' finances and must be ready to pitch in whenever unforeseen expenses arise. With help from his parents, Max bought his own house in 1985. Today, his parents are financially secure and his home is all paid for and appreciating value. Max is free to focus on the future to provide a safety net for a launching pad for his own children. Last slide. Byron and Max are real people. Their names have been changed. They are the directors of California Newsreel, the company that produced this television series. As you can see, in one generation, discrimination makes a big difference in the relative wealth of these two people. In 1995, the average white family had 8 times the wealth of the average non-white family. Even at the same income level, whites have on average twice the wealth of black families. Wealth isn't just about luxury, it's about the starting point for the next generation. Until the wealth gap is addressed, whites will continue to have an advantage over non-whites generation after generation. It's funny, as an educator, I've spent most of my career trying to figure out the achievement gap because I knew that it tied to a bigger picture. And it wasn't until the last few years that the wealth gap has become more important to me. Part of the reason is this: when it comes to having real meaningful relationships with people of other races, if you live in the same neighborhood and your kids grow up together, you probably attend the same schools because we line out schools as far boundaries as far as where you live. Sooner or later, unless you're a hateful person, you actually talk to your neighbor. You might start barbecuing and doing other things together. So you form the kind of lifelong relationships that break down a lot of barriers. Because you know what? Blacks have stereotypes as far as whites do with blacks. It just is. And some of that is a lack of contact and interaction. When I was growing up in Racine, it was when all these people were moving from all over. As I said before, you had African Americans moving up from the South. But some of my friends, their parents or grandparents moved to Racine from Armenia. You know, there's that movie, The Promise, which I can't wait to go see because there was a Holocaust among the Armenians around World War I. But some of my friends, their families moved from Turkey and other places. I have friends that are from Serbia and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and all of that. So I went to school with people from all these different cultures. The neighborhood I lived in had people from all these different cultures. My father, there was an older widow lady, I think they came from Yugoslavia, Mrs. Levance. She was a widow, and if it snowed 15 inches, my dad would just look at me and say, and Mrs. Levance, God bless her heart, would give me a quarter. And I don't care when it was, a quarter to shovel out 10, 15 inches of snow. If it was the 1800s, a quarter wouldn't have been enough money. Which was a testimony to my dad, because my dad took care of people in the neighborhood. But it was a neighborhood where people came from all over, so we got those opportunities. But back to the wealth gap, what happens is it does give a starting point. Now, to be honest with you, people would say, yeah, but Max is not typical of most Americans. And I would have to give you that. But Max is indicative of opportunity. If you have opportunities that are unhindered by race, think of it like this. I love sports cars. And I can go out and I can buy a 600 some horsepower Corvette. But if you tell me the only way I can drive the car is I got to reach down, take the emergency brake, and pull it as hard as I can and then go forward. It's a different experience than if you tell me I don't have to have the emergency brake impeding my progress. And for people of the last few generations, though there's been opportunity, the Corvette, there's been the emergency brake pulled on. And that's what the wealth gap, does. Now, how do you fix that? One of the things that I'd like to see, I have a neighbor who owns a construction company. And what he's done is he's made a decision, my oldest son, Nate, he's connected with Nate, and he told him, I want you to get into an apprenticeship program to be a carpenter. My son was a custodian for Kenosha Unified for like 9 years. And so Ed said, one of the reasons why I want you to do this is I own this big construction company. He said, Nate, you've been out at the job site, and you know there are no African Americans. Now, I got to tell you this, with all the people in the trades, there are millions of people in the trades. Many of them are getting older. And so the number of people that it will take to replace them is millions of people. So there's great opportunity. By the way, when I was growing up, it was, you got to go to college. Now, you got to go to the trades. I remember my mother saying, son, if I were you, I want you to go to college, but after you go to college, to hedge your bet, you need to become a plumber. And I had the stereotypical image of the plumber, bent over, showing part of their backs. I thought, no. Gives new meaning to the term crack baby, doesn't it? But so I said no, because I wanted to be a white collar worker. I didn't want to do that. And every time a plumber comes to my house and I got to cut a check, I sit there and I go, Mom, you were right. I could be the person saying, that little ball that's floating in your toilet, got to replace it. Looks like about $400 to me. Thanks to my father-in-law, I'm handy enough that I can replace the little ball, so I don't have to get a plumber for that. But Ed has told Nate, and I want to reach out and I want to find as many kids of color as I can and to help them, because I don't like things the way they are. Now, I wish he was the rule rather than the exception. But in order to change some of that, and when you think about the wealth gap, here's what this bodes well for. He told Nate, in a few years, you'll make $46, $47 an hour. Okay? You project that out, meaning he'll be able to get a house, you have decent transportation. If he's smart in managing his money, he'll buy a house in a place where he can accumulate equity. He's also entrepreneurial. Nate owns a piece of property in downtown Kenosha already. With the equity from his home and his smarts and his job, he should be able to begin accumulating wealth for the next generation. See, so when people say, oh, why is race important? Because unfortunately, the impact of it didn't stop in 1967, 68. It's still going forward. If people would ask me, why do you think there's an academic achievement gap? I'm baffled, because I sat in the same classroom. There was George Chardukian there was Janie there, and there was Milt there. We all heard the same thing. We all got the same education. So I can't explain to you completely why, especially when you go back to the fact that when I was growing up in Racine, most of us had two-parent households too. So you couldn't say, well, it's because of, no, because that, and when it came to having a moral base, most of the people that I knew, it would have been rare for people not to have been church attenders. So you even had that advantage. But when I look at the guys I went to high school with, and even my older brothers who are older, and I see some of their friends were computer techs for Miller and for other companies. And I saw incredible achievement among that generation for some reason that I'm not saying currently. It's not a knock on the younger generation. It's not, but I'm just not. Maybe part of it is because many of our parents came up from the South and had to work to posture us. And for some of us, even though we're hardworking, they put us in a good enough place that our kids sort of get things and they don't have that same kind of work ethic. Next, please. The other reason why race is important is, and I could have done pages of collages on this. When I started writing the book, the only one in the room, what happened was, I have a friend toward the end, I'm going to show you a picture of her. Peggy and I met this lady when she was a high school student. She went to a youth group that we ran. And she became a freelance writer and writes for Charisma magazine and other magazines. And so when I started writing the book, I knew I'm pretty good at telling a story, but when it comes to the grammar and everything, Scripture says, be not deceived. And so I knew that she could organize everything. And so after writing the first draft, she and I would pass the manuscript back and forth. And while we were passing it back and forth, at first I said to her this, I said, because we started writing around 2013, I said, I don't know if a book on race is going to be real relevant anymore. And then Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, we had to tell ourselves after a while, we're not adding anything else to the book. Because we began to, and we weren't flip about it, it was just the truth. We began to call the subject of race the gift that kept on giving. Because if you were going to write a book on race, it was more about, should we comment on this? Should this be on that? And I put up 4 of the most egregious. I could have put up Eric Garner too. Eric Garner was the guy who was selling bootleg cigarettes in New York and was put in an illegal chokehold and died while selling bootleg cigarettes. Terrence Crutcher was the man who, again, think of what technology does as far as raising the awareness. He was the man who was pulled over in Tulsa. He wasn't posing a threat. He didn't have a weapon. I think he went back to his car he went back toward his car. People now are smart enough that it's like they go back hands up, and a female police officer shot him. And not only did it got recorded by multiple sources. I think one was a helicopter flying over, and there were officers coming to her aid. So if she had felt threatened, all she had to do was wait. And if he had hopped in his car and driven off, it's like my dad told me, you can't outrun radar. You don't get him right now, you get him down the road. You have Freddie Gray, who was in the back of the paddy wagon in Baltimore. You have Walter Scott, that was one of the saddest ones in South Carolina, pulled over because of an expired license plate, 8 bullets in the back while he was, again, caught on video while he was running, but he was limping away. So as much as I would love to tell you that we have made significant progress, every time that I'm just about to sell out to the significant progress, things like this happen. And I didn't, look, if you're black or you're white, the police pull you over and you reach for a gun, may they empty their clip. You're a fool. Sorry, You are. If you're going to pull a gun on a police officer, you're taking your chance. But I'm telling you that unarmed, when my sons and I talk about this, the number one thing we talk about given technology is, why don't you just tase him? People have died being tased. I understand it's not foolproof, but if you were going to do something to me, I'd rather have you because I might survive that. If you empty your gun into me. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm law-abiding. Last time I got a ticket for speeding, I really became law-abiding. And so I use cruise control, and I don't play you can set it 5 miles above, because if they're really looking to catch somebody, you're 5 miles above, they can catch you. So I set the cruise control. And when I was superintendent in Pulaski, I'd come home every other weekend, drive down to Kenosha, and then drive back. So one Sunday afternoon, I'm driving back. I'm driving along I-43, about to go by Sheboygan. And I think, okay, cruise is set, you know, sunroof is open. The world is just a wonderful place. And then I look at the rearview mirror, and the lights are flashing. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh, what are they going to pull me over? I know I'm not speeding. So what I then do, and it sounds similar to the survival skills that my parents taught when we would go south. So I know the survival skills for interaction with police. So pull over, I grip that steering wheel like I'm trying to make finger impressions in it. Doesn't cross my mind to even think about reaching for my wallet, for my driver's license, or God forbid you reach over to get your registration. I'm like a statue. The officer comes alongside the car, and you know, my heartbeat is racing and my palms are sweating and all that. Comes alongside the car, taps the window for me to roll it down. The sense of peace that I felt when I turned and looked at him, and he was young and he was Hispanic. I can't even, it's almost like the peace that passes understanding, because my anxiety shut down. I found comfort in the fact that it wasn't a white police officer, because I thought, well, you probably faced some discrimination. I didn't think, I knew I wasn't speeding, but even if I had been, I didn't think, do a brother a solid, you know? You know. And what he said next was, he said, sir, it's dusk and your lights weren't on. And then he did something that I've never had a police officer do before or since. Reaches in the car, pats me on the back, and says, have a wonderful day. Now, why would I share that story? Because if I'm law-abiding, and if I have that kind of anxiety in interactions with police officers, can you imagine? Because, you know, I guess I'm arrogant enough to believe, yeah, if I'm, you know, if because of my job that I had and other things, some people think, well, you're something. If I feel that way, imagine how everybody else feels too. Next slide. Showed you a picture of my family as far as my brothers and sisters. Now I get into my kids. My kids are, start with Matt, because I've got another slide with Nate. Matt and Nate are my two sons that people could guess that Nate is African American because he's adopted. He's not mixed. He's not formally mixed because, trust me, as I look down the back of my hand, I can see freckles. So even people that say they're not mixed, given slavery and what happened then, if there's a pure blood African American somewhere, I'd love to meet him. And so for Matt, whenever Matt, the one to the far right, whenever Matt is going to fly someplace, he knows he's going to be taking off his shoes. He's going to get pulled into that line on the side, because when people have to identify what he looks like, he looks to them sort of Middle Eastern. Same skin tone and other things. So that's his thing. Tom, who's in the middle, is a special ed teacher, lives in Harlem, used to live in Manhattan. Tom went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tom and Dan, the one to the left, both graduated from Madison. And they would tell me, Dad, given how many students there were, hardly any of them are kids of color. So they let me into that world. But Tom's a special ed teacher, lived in Manhattan, had a rich fraternity brother who happened to go to school in Madison. They became close. His rich fraternity brother, talk about the wealth gap, owned an apartment in New York and let Tom live in the apartment for a measly $1,300 a month rent. I thought, I wish I owned an apartment in New York. There'd be so many people in that apartment, I'd have them crammed in. Tom, I asked the question, I said, you've got friends that you went to college with and all of this, and some of them are wealthy. Do they have any other black friends? He said, no. I said, what about their parents? Because Tom, goes out to spend time in their homes. And what about their parents? He said, no, not really. He said, as a matter of fact, I got to tell you something. One of my friends was really struggling, and he was going to go to work for a restaurant, as a server, because he was really struggling. And his mom told him he'd better not, because it was below standard. Tom said most of the restaurant workers in New York City are people of color or immigrants, hardly ever white. And so I thought, okay, that's something I didn't know. I put some of that in the book. The nice thing about, once I started talking to my family about race, again, it's the gift they kept on giving. They had so many stories. For the two of them, when they were in high school, they were in advanced placement classes. They were the only blacks in those classes. Park High School in Racine, Trimper High School in Kenosha, same experience. Oh, Dan, the youngest, is a newspaper editor in a small town in Indiana. When he was a newspaper editor in a very small town in Nebraska, he said people tried to figure out what he was. And so he shared one experience where he said, I was sitting in a restaurant in a small town. There was a guy across the room and he kept staring at me. And I knew what he was gonna do. And he said, I kept looking down at my food and I kept telling myself, don't look up, don't look up, don't look up. Because if I look up, it's like giving him permission. He said, but I couldn't help it. I looked up and the guy comes across the room and then he says, what are you? And you know what? At first you go, boy, that's insulting. But sometimes to have conversations on race, if you want to have meaningful conversations, you've got to allow that people are going to do ignorant things every once in a while. And Dan's pretty easygoing. So Dan said, in my family background, there's Choctaw, Indian, German, African American, and then he said, and Irish. And when he shared it with me, I said, Tom, there's no Irish in our family. He said, I was on such a roll, I just thought I'd throw in Irish. Little Irish on the side. I think the name of that chapter is Irish for Good Measure, or With Good Measure. Because well, what's funny is when he grows his beard really out, he looks like a member of ZZ Top, you know. And so the other thing we joke about is to be a male in my family, you got to have a beard. Otherwise, you're just not a member of the family. Next slide, please. And then we have Nate. That's Matt on the left, that's Nate on the right. Nate we adopted when he was 21 days old. So we're the only parents he's ever known. Nate has been pulled over on his way to work, not speeding, by police. And when, you know, he's been pulled over in our neighborhood. We live in a decent neighborhood in Kenosha. It's not a gated community or anything like that. And one time he was pulled over and police officer said, "What are you doing here?" And Nate said, "Well, I'm visiting my parents." "Your parents, where do they live?" "They live right there." The officer was embarrassed. It's Kenosha, and it was a few years ago. One time he was going fast to try to go to work. Police pulled him over and said, why are you speeding?" "Officer, you caught me. I was in the wrong. I was going to work." "Where do you work?" He said, "Well, I left my keys in the building, but I'm a custodian for the school district." So the officer followed him all the way there. Nate went in the building, got his keys and his ID, and came out and proved that he was gainfully employed. So he's had those kinds of experiences. With him, I've had to pull, my greatest fear, my greatest concern has been that Nate could become bitter because of his experiences. You know, and there are times where I've got to pull him back from the brink so that he doesn't believe that somehow his life and opportunities are diminished because of that. But to be honest with you, lately it's been easier to do because Ed, the next door neighbor, is opening doors. It's easy to prove there isn't the kind of racism that you can believe there is if people who are of another race are actually doing everything they can to open a door for you, not against you. Nate also, Nate loves rap music. When it first came out, I thought, this will be gone so fast. The low-hanging pants, I thought, worst fashion statement ever. Nate, it'll be gone. Your pants will be as tight as anybody. Here we are, what? How many? A decade or two later, the pants are still hanging low, and it's like, it's, you know, he said, "Dad, how do you like my music?" I said, "It's gangsta crap, not gangster rap." So, and you know what? Yeah, but isn't that, yeah, different generations believe that their music is wonderful. I'm still stuck in the 60s and 70s, little bit of the 80s. Couldn't, you know, forget the 90s didn't exist to me. And he realizes when he goes out for job interviews, because that's how he is when he's at home, he knows how to play the game. He can dress up and do all of that because he realizes especially how he's going to be perceived as opposed to my other three sons. Next, please. Here's a picture that I had taken at the Wisconsin School Board Convention in Milwaukee. This is before one of the sessions. And the reason that I had this picture taken was I was in process of writing the book, and I went to this convention every year, and you know, when the ballroom's all full, there's around 1,000 people. And it's all the superintendents, it's all the business officials, and all the school board members in the state of Wisconsin. So they're the movers, the shakers, the, you know, decision makers at the district level and all of that. And I can remember sitting there and doing a head count. And, you know, I try not to be overly race conscious, because it doesn't serve a purpose to, go into McDonald's and go, 1, 2, 3, to find some number that you're comfortable with, where you go, yeah, there's enough people that are like me. I feel comfortable eating in this place, so I try not to do that. But I'll tell you, most of the time that I went to that, the highest count I ever had was 6, including myself. And these are the people who make the decisions. These are the people who make the decisions as to what education is like in the state of Wisconsin. The other thing that's a reality is this. Currently, because of the retirement of the Racine superintendent being replaced by an African-American male, out of 424, 425, there are now 3 African-American superintendents, 1 Hispanic. It's shameful. At one point during my career, there were 2. So when issues come up of education, of the achievement gap and others, you don't have people sitting at the table who have, it's a bad pun, and I don't mean it as a pun, skin in the game, who really are invested in those issues on a more personal level, because I can see me in the kids who are affected by the gap. And so I sat there, I had the picture taken, and I thought, this has got to change. And people have asked me, they've said, so how does it change? And rolling back to affirmative action kinds of things, as a superintendent, if there were not enough female administrators in the school district, behind closed doors, let me tell you, we had that conversation. And I would say, okay, we've got a principal opening, let's look at the applications, and we would make sure that there was a significant number of female candidates. We wouldn't lower the standard, and just, we don't care, just as long as the person can breathe. It wasn't that. They had to be, but we screened them in as opposed to screening them out. You get what I mean? And so consequently, we were doing affirmative action based upon gender. And nobody thought anything negative about it. It was like, yeah, that needs to happen because women are, underrepresented and all of that. And I understood that. But I would watch at the country at large, and I'd watch court cases where, districts were trying to do those kinds of things, and the courts would slap that down, saying, nope, it's not fair to gerrymander things in that direction. And I'd sit there and I'd go, I gerrymander, at the district level on those kinds of things. And it's not to guarantee an outcome, except for this. If I have 10 candidates and none of them, and I'll use the female example, if none of those 10 are women, what chance is there that a woman's going to get a job as an administrator in my district? There's no chance. Now, it's funny, in professional sports, in the NFL, they got smart to this. And at first, I sort of resented it because it seemed like tokenism. And they changed something that was called the Rooney Rule. And the Rooney Rule, named after Art Rooney, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, it was either Art or his son Dan. They were powerful enough among the owners that they said, look, we got to change things. And so the first step is we got to make sure that some of the assistant coaches who are African Americans get interviewed. And so you can't fill a position in the NFL without at least giving an interview. And what happened was, at first, it was token. I'd pick up a paper and they'd say, the new coach of the Kansas City Chiefs is, and then they'd go, oops, Rooney Rule. And then they'd go back and they'd interview people, and then the person that they announced first still got the job. So it took them a while to get used to it. But you know what it led to? Tony Dungy, Lovie Smith, Marvin Lewis, you know, the coach of the Steelers, and so on and so forth. That which started out in an almost forced way opened the door to opportunity to people who are highly qualified. Some of the people that I named have won Super Bowls or have gotten their teams to a Super Bowl. So there's no doubt that they're qualified. So next slide, please. Last thing I want to talk about is the opportunity gap, because some of the things, because President Obama was elected, there are people that go, oh, good, the door's open for anybody. So you can sit there and tell a child legitimately, you too can be president if they're a child of color. Except the reality of how you become president doesn't validate that. There are 45 members of Congress who are black. By the way, they're all Democrats. There are no Republican black members of Congress. There are only 2 black senators, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. There are currently no black governors anywhere in the United States. There was a black governor during Reconstruction. The first one was in 1870. The next was in 1990. Yeah, 120 years later. There have been 2 in the last 25 years, DeVal Patrick and Doug Wilder, but Doug Wilder was 1990. I don't remember who the other was. If that's the case, then there's little opportunity to wield real power because you're not at the table making decisions. And the rest is historical. To me, this is almost the culmination of you have an achievement gap and you have a wealth gap, which then leads to the opportunity gap. So you can sit there and tell some kids, someday you can be president, but most of our presidents have come from the governor's mansion. So if there aren't any in the governor's mansion, there won't be any in the White House. Yeah, you've had a few senators, but that's a crapshoot. Very few people have gone from the Senate. Hardly anybody goes from the House of Representatives. And again, 45 in the House of Representatives, but that's not the door that gets you there, no matter how talented you are. So that to me is the opportunity gap of why is race important? Because I'm hoping that in a generation, nobody's standing in a church holding a microphone, having a book called I'm Still the Only One in the Room, or something like that, you know, to talk about these things. But unless things like this change, then the numbers won't change at all. Next, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about this. As a matter of fact, this is tomorrow. But so given everything that I've talked about, what role does the church play in your mind? Anybody want to be the guinea pig, the sacrificed lamb, want to jump in? What role do you think the church plays?
Should be the example.
Okay, the church should be the example.
Community.
Okay, the church should demonstrate community. If you hear music in the background, that's because I set a timer. Again, something I never do. I think it's the theme from Rocky. I find it inspirational. Okay, so community and to set the example. Next slide. Okay, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow, but how should Christians view race and racial conflict? Yes.
I think that loving each other is central to the gospel. If one of our brothers or sisters are not being loved, then we're ignoring the message of Jesus.
Okay, so loving one another is central to the gospel. If we notice that someone's not being loved, then it's central to the message of Jesus. And Because I tell you, that is a key question. How do Christians view? Because I would contend, and tomorrow I'll really contend, that how the world sees things is not a blueprint for how I'm going to see things at all. Yes. So you don't think that Christians view you think that there's avoidance or denial? Sir, did you? Same thing? And see, that's part of my concern is I think that there are people, and Christians are part of it, who've seen progress, because if I show you the signs from Jim Crow to today, only a person who's brain dead would say there hasn't been progress. There has been progress. But then when you look at the wealth gap and everything else, you go, but if the goal is to level the playing field isn't level. And so how do you do that? How do you acknowledge that it's still an issue? But again, how do you see it differently? The world's playbook to solve this is pretty much repetitive throughout the last few generations. It's this or it's that. See, it's you either do this or you do that. And if we have the mind of Christ, I don't believe we're a this or that group of people. I believe that there are solutions that God has to solve most of the major problems of our day that never get explored because A, there aren't enough Daniels in key position. You know, the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament is a type of the church in this regard. God, the majority of Christians don't work in a pulpit ministry like you and I do. The vast majority of Christians work in businesses, some work in government, some work other places, and could have impact to solve problems that are long-standing, like Daniel. Daniel was in a pagan empire, the Babylonian Empire. He worked for the worst boss in history. They believe Nebuchadnezzar invented crucifixion. He was horrible. He got angry at 3 guys who wouldn't bow down to a statue and tried to barbecue them. So what, you think you got problems with your boss, Yet it's said that whenever there was a problem, Nebuchadnezzar, after a while, I believe at first he'd go to the wise men and the Chaldeans and all of them and say, hey, what do you guys think? But after a while, I think he got smart and he stopped talking to them. He said, hey, bring Daniel in. And Daniel would come in, and even though he had been to Babylon University, Daniel would pray. And God would give him solutions that weren't A or B. They were different. And I believe that that's what God wants to do concerning race. Race is very complex. There are no easy answers to this. To me, part of the answer is people like my neighbor Ed, who have the wherewithal and the heart, but he has resources. If people like him decide to get involved, they can make change happen. I think it's more on the individual level, because I've lived through the government trying to solve the problem decade after decade, and I've got to tell you, there are limitations to what they can do. They still should be involved, but I think that more traction happens when individuals take this on as their call. Last slide. And I want you to think about this before tomorrow. Is there a difference between a biblical view on race and a political view? Is there a difference between a biblical view on race and a political view? Spoiler alert, I've already let the cat out of the bag. I'm becoming more and more apolitical because I've watched decade after decade after decade, And I think the solutions come from the church, unless the church limits themselves to what the world does. Then it doesn't matter if it comes from the church. If the church is going to mimic the world, to me that falls into where Jesus said, what happens when the salt has lost its flavor? Then it's worthless. It's, should be thrown, one translation says, onto a dung heap. So, are there questions for me? We've got a few minutes. Questions you have for me? Anything that I've said? It's funny, Pastor, at the end of every service, I let people ask questions. And some have asked me questions about like the second coming. And I've said, how long do you want to be sitting there, because I can't answer that question in a few minutes, but it's fascinating. Any questions for me? Comments? Yes, sir.
It's interesting. I appreciated the sharing of the wealth gap and the achievement gap. I think those are two key things. I don't know how you measure it, but the other thing that seems, I don't have an answer, I can't get my head around this, is the aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Like you talked about not having qualified women to come into the pool for a potential administrator job in the district. What is how do you work to begin to develop, I have an answer.
Mm-hmm.
How do you begin to develop an aspiration to say, well, you started as a kindergarten teacher. Now I want, I would like to go get my administrator's license.
Right.
I'd like to get my master's
Sure.
to then be in the position to say, I'd like to be considered for a principal's position. And who knows, maybe a superintendent's position somewhere down the road. This idea of this aspirational, another way I say it is, how do you fill the funnel?
Mm-hmm.
People to begin to move, or maybe another way is to start going up the ladder. How do you put more ladders out there to get people?
You brought up a very good point, and I'll tell you, part of that solution, or part of what has to happen is this. If I'm a principal today, okay? If I'm a principal today and I sit and I think, I'd like to be a superintendent. And, fortunately, because of my parents and others, I was willing to be a pioneer. Some people aren't. I don't blame them, because it's not easy being a pioneer. But if I do my homework and I find out at one point,